What justification could you have for spending 3 beats on the same harmony? Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers interested in composition. Today I want to show you how the French learn fugue. When you're composing a fugue, one of the biggest things you have to think about are the major sections which are defined by the keys. Let's begin. One of the most important things when you're composing a fugue is you have to be able to recognize tonic to dominant. So in this example here, notice that I have a C and a G, or the bastonnet, as we call it in French, has a C and a G. So automatically I'm thinking a C chord. The next chord has an A and an F. So I see a C to F. So I see a dominant to tonic relationship. This is not something that just me telling you you're going to magically be able to do. It has to come from experience. So it's something you want to start addressing specifically in harmony studies. Notice how I harmonized it. So just out of the blue, the most exciting way to harmonize what we see on the screen would be have the leading tone in the soprano resolving up to the tonic. Obviously, we're going to have to do counterpoint. We're going to have to make all kinds of interesting things so that this realization is nice and sexy, shall we say. But nevertheless, these root skills are what are driving me at the moment. Another really important skill is you have to be able to recognize the descending third. So in the Henri Chalon harmony workbook series, which is what I do in France, usually in France you're using the Henri Chalon or La Renaud. Maybe there's some others now. It's been gone for some time now. But in that book, it's in first inversions, he first introduces this descending third. And what you're going to learn, there's 3 different ways to, typically the formulas, to fill in a descending third. But specifically, if the descending third is the scale degree 5 to scale degree 3, the most satisfactory way is to interpret it as a dominant tonic. So in this example, we have the leading tone in the soprano going up to the tonic, okay? So notice again and again and again how harmony is guiding me. And I just want to remind everyone that obviously, for the computed fugue, we can't just have a stationary soprano like this. But this is how I'm figuring out the fugue petit à petit, as we say in French, little by little, is figuring out the essential harmony. One other thing I forgot to mention is both in example A and in example B, notice I have le chiffre, as we say in French, I have the Roman numerals. So first we have a 5 to 1 6, and of course a 5 to 1 6 again. And notice in the second example, I have that line. In French, we call that entrée, okay? And what it means is the harmony is staying the same. It's just an inversion is changing. One other thing, so notice that I have a voice exchange, or I harmonize this as a voice exchange. So the bass is doing E to C. Even though there are notes in between, one of the skills you're going to need if you want to study fugue, well, just compose your own fugue, but even if you want to study fugue in the French style, is you're going to have to be able to see patterns. You have to see what's actually happening. So those notes in between, the 16th notes, that doesn't trip me up because I know basic harmony. And one of the things that we learn in basic harmony, and again, this would be addressed in the first book of the Henri Chalon, which is that I use to teach harmony. It would be in the first inversion sections. We talked about when you have a third, the leap of a third, there's almost always a formula, okay? And when you listen to great classical music, obviously these composers knew harmony super well. They maybe didn't learn in the French style, but they have that like hands-on understanding. Notice that in this case, I voiced it as a voice exchange because we're going from a 3 to a 1. The E is the third in C major, going to a 1. And the most common way that we voice this, the most interesting way we learn through harmony studies, is going to be by doing a voice exchange. So the soprano is going to be the opposite. Just as a reminder, once we realize the actual fugue, it may not be in the soprano, it may be in the alto. It really depends on the circumstances. But right now, I'm just plotting out the harmony. So we successfully figured out the harmony in the first part of the fugue. The first part of the fugue, I like to call the exposition. I know that's not the official term, but generally in the first part of the fugue, you're going to be alternating between the tonic and the dominant. The point is to bring in all the voices, and once you've brought in all the voices, then you, en voyage, as we say in French, then you start to travel to different keys. Notice that we have the principal notes of a G minor chord, right? We start on the beat on a G, okay? And then we leap to a B flat. One of the things we learn in harmony, and this also may be addressed in contrapuntal studies, is that when you have leaps, it has to be a note from the chord. It's very rare that you're going to be allowed to leap directly to a dissonance. So if you see a leap, it means those notes are going to be part of the chord. Now, of course, when you compose your own fugue in your own style, these rules may not apply. Of course, when you're composing a fugue in your own style, you don't know the rules. You're just listening to what you want, and later someone can, find things in common and call that rules. But in this common practice era language, if we're going to be having a leap like this within the beat, then these are part notes from the chord. So we have a G and a B flat. Notice at the end of the first beat, we leap from the B flat back to the G. And then on beat 3, we go to a B flat. So all I see is G and B flat. So to me, what justification could you have for spending 3 beats on the same harmony in such a short exercise, other than that you are on this chord and you're in this key? Now, notice that on beat 2, we have an F natural. We don't have the F sharp, which would confirm that we're in G minor. So definitely when you're realizing this, you're going to have to think about how to properly modulate. We're probably not fully in G minor, but the essential thing is you recognize the chord that would signify that we're in G minor. Another thing I notice is that we are staying on the D for basically an entire measure. Now, what justification could there be for that? This is something you learn again in harmony, right? When you're doing these exercises, I can't speak for other cultures, but in the French culture, you're going to see, for example, a soprano line, and you have to hear below, and you'll see the soprano staying on one note for a whole measure, and now the other measures, you're moving by half note or a quarter note or something like that, and then suddenly you have a whole note in the middle of the exercise. That almost always has to be a dominant, because that's the only chord that's going to really justify that kind of stationary existence without boring the listener in such a short time period. So when I see that D there, automatically my brain is thinking we're on the dominant, coupled with the investigative work, if we can call it that we did the measure prior with the G minor. We see G and D. Again, do you see beneath all the surface level skills I'm saying that are necessary to do this kind of work, notice that it's always revolving around the tonic and dominant relationship. This relationship has to be understood like viscerally because you've experienced, because you've done, writing exercises. It cannot be learned intellectually or grasped intellectually. It won't help you intellectually. Notice how I voiced it just temporarily, right? I have the F sharp, okay? So one of the things we learn in harmony are the outer voices. So if you're on the dominant, how is the listener going to know it's the dominant? Well, we're on the D, so what's the other pivotal note we need to communicate that it's the dominant? Well, it's going to be the leading tone. So notice I have the F sharp. Now, where does it occur in the measure? we're not totally sure yet. Something you may want to do when you do realize this exercise, and I hope that you do, is maybe delay the arrival of the leading tone as long as possible, possibly through a suspension, so that when we get to that leading tone, it feels well earned. Now, one thing that can trip you up is if we resolve the leading tone directly to the G, notice that it doesn't align with the bass. Notice that the bass is on A and then goes to the G. So as we can see in this temporary sketch, my assumption is that the bass is doing like an accented passing tone or something like that. And these things can obviously get changed, but part of the beauty of these kind of exercises is you have mastered the basics, you have a good level in basic harmony, so you can focus on these things and I like this or I don't like that. The next thing I want to show you are the courtesy accidentals. So notice that we have this F natural. In an exercise where the global key is F major, okay, there's no need to put a natural sign. So when they're putting a courtesy accidental, that is a signal to you that there would have been an F sharp in an inner voice prior. Now, based on the temporary sketch I just did with the F sharp and the soprano, that makes perfect sense. And again, we may certainly put these in other voices, and we will have to do the counterpoint. But notice how every step of the way we haven't discussed counterpoint. It is not even part of the equation yet because we have to know the harmony to do this exercise. So we have that F natural, and then also notice that we have the E flat. Okay, so you may have thought, okay, we're leaving G minor, but then when we have that E flat and go to D, it kind of reaffirms that we're still in G minor. The second to last thing I want to talk about is the perfect authentic cadence. Okay, notice I put a temporary placeholder with the soprano. This is just so I can sketch out, get a feel for the piece. Now, when you compose a fugue in your own style, by the way, the hardest part is going to be the management of keys. You start in, obviously, the tonic, alternate between tonic and dominant, and then you have to go to other major sections. So one of the cool things about this study is it's making you aware of what are the major keys that we're going to, and then at a later point, we're going to work on a more minute level within each section. So I put the F sharp to G just to outline it in the soprano. Obviously, we can't have the same solution that we had in the previous example for hanging on the dominant. That's just going to be boring to the listener. But the point isn't to get the final result, it's just to get closer to getting the final result. Another thing to think about is that in this exercise, you're not going to really be making up new lines. You're going to have to really study this text and look what is in this bass line that I can recycle, as they say in French, in other voices. But for now, we're just trying to figure out the global harmony and the key sections. So here we have a perfect authentic cadence, all right? The perfect authentic cadence we usually avoid in the middle of a phrase or a piece because we don't want to stop the motion. We don't want to stop the piece. However, the global key is F major. So in the middle of the exercise, we don't really want a perfect authentic cadence in the middle of a phrase, but to show that we're coming to the end, it's really nice to have a perfect authentic cadence because it tells the listener this is done, and we're going to very quickly start moving to another key. The final thing I want to show you is how to cancel out a key. Okay, so notice here that we have an F natural and then E natural. Okay, and it's really that E natural that tells us that we're no longer in G minor. Remember prior, there were moments where we did have an F natural and it was still G minor. But here, by taking away that E flat, we're moving to another key. If you want to start getting closer to Fugue, or you're not quite sure what to do with Fugue, I would highly suggest is working on harmony, because as you can see from what I've showed, every step of the way we had to rely on a basic understanding of harmony, and that makes it a lot more enjoyable. So